Nope, that's as far as the power goes. All right. All right, so this is apparently the best we're going to do today. So more or less success, I guess. I've defeated the failing technology museum that is the U of A. All right. That was a lot of running upstairs. Okay, sorry. It's like, all right, to teach today, you must first run a small race. All right. And then bring a TV down from the 5th floor. Okay, what the fuck? Oh, this is my life. See, this is where I actually made this plan last time. I'm like, if this ever happens again, I'll go upstairs and get the TV. Okay. I'm right. All right. We were talking last time. How are you? Okay. So mini labs. Nope. I didn't get any panicked emails over the weekend. So I'm assuming everything went okay with them. Okay. So I haven't talked to L'Oreal yet, but we'll get started on marking those probably tomorrow and get you some feedback on it. We'll kind of go from there. Okay. Okay. You know, problem solving is fun, but it does slightly discombobulate you. You're like, oh my God, I must solve this problem. All right, let's go. So last time, yes, we were talking about ethics. We got just a couple slides left. And we ended off on this slide talking about duty to report. And basically, like in a nutshell, you know, anything where, you know, you'd have to report in another circumstance. Right, you know, of harm being done to a vulnerable person, a child, a crime that you have reasonable certainty will be committed, like someone has told you that they're going to kill their neighbor tomorrow at noon and you don't think it's just idle talk. You have a duty to report all of that stuff, you know, for the safety of your participants. And, you know, that should be built into your disclosures at the beginning, right, in your consent letter and all of that fun stuff. Okay. The last one, and again, so I got justice and I got concern for welfare. Data encryption, this is probably the hardest one in some ways because, you know, I guess there's two things. Like encryption, you know, I talked about last time. Generally speaking, most people put in their, you know, letter of consent that the data is going to be encrypted and all of that stuff. And technically, I mean, if you're keeping it on your personal laptop, that's basically true. Like if it's a Windows laptop, it's using BitLocker encryption. So that's true. Increasingly, you know, more and more of us are using things like cloud storage to store data because it's much more secure in the sense that you're less likely to, you know, the hard drive is less likely to get dropped in the water or lost because you forgot what drawer you put it in or whatever. So that would be something you probably want to just disclose if you're doing. It's becoming more normalized. There are, of course, some huge online privacy concerns. You know, how much access does Microsoft have? How much access does Google have, or Dropbox, or whatever corporation is hosting your cloud storage? And that is something that the Research Ethics Board might ask you questions about, but it is definitely something, you know, that you'll, because we're in that age, unless you are actually locking your files physically in a cabinet, in a building, you can say that, but most people aren't. So just always think about that. Like, how are you going to store the data? Okay, and this last little piece in terms of concern for welfare has to do with online analysis. Now with online analysis, there's a bunch of different things that we could probably talk about. So some of it is publicly accessible, right? So think about, like, you know, if someone's posting on their personal Facebook, especially if they're putting, I don't know, nobody uses Facebook anymore. Let's say more realistically, Instagram or, you know, Twitter X. Twitter X, right? X is a stupid name. So, and all of these things are public. For this sort of scenario, chances are if you're collecting data, it does have to do with human beings, but they've put it out in such a way as it's publicly accessible. So you probably don't need ethics approval to use publicly posted information, right? Or say you're, Reddit. Reddit would be the other one, right? If you decide that you're going to do like, you wanted to understand the lives of U of A students by going to r/U Alberta and sort of looking at publicly available posts, you probably don't need research ethics approval for that. You could apply for it just to be safe, but because it's publicly available, right, anyone can look at it, chances are you don't need to even ask. Now, the kind of gray area with online comes in more kind of publics, but and this is where online is a little bit awkward. Public/private spaces, right? Like say a chat, or say even something like Reddit. Are they asking me what I did with the TV and why I was running through the hall? No. Okay. Where is the TV? Why was some crazy person in a red shirt running away with it? We'll never know. Even something like, so here I said Reddit's probably fine. If you're soliciting information, right? So if you go on Reddit and you start to interact with people and you're using those interactions as the basis for something you're using in research, right? You make a post in r/U Alberta and then you record the discussion that happens, right? Or you start actively participating in the discussions, prompting responses, then you've entered a pretty big moral or an ethical gray zone, right? So online data collection, especially of that publicly accessible information, is definitely a growing field. The second you start to, join in, and I know it says chat room because, I took this out of the textbook, and the textbook, is already a few years old, and we're far beyond like, IRC chats. These kind of discussion forums, chat rooms, open boards like Reddit do create a sort of problem if you start to interact, because then you are soliciting responses, then you are actually potentially causing things to happen in that space. And if you're, especially say, if it was like me doing it and I'm like, hello, fellow students, what do you think of this, right? What is that, Saturday Night Live or Kids in the Hall meme of I can't remember the actor. Hello, fellow kids, right? If you start to do that, you're doing covert research, and it's something that at very least you should get research ethics approval for, because suddenly now you're misrepresenting or you're not being completely honest about who you are and what the purpose of these posts. You're not giving people a fair chance to decide whether they want to participate. Now, if you went on and you were like, hey, I am a researcher and I want to talk to you about this, different story. You would need ethics for that. You'd need a pro number and all of that fun stuff, but you're not doing covert research. The internet, though, does obviously offer a chance for you to jump in, right, to r/furries on Reddit and be like, I am a furry also and would like information about furries. Nothing suspicious about me at all. Haha. Yeah, that kind of, the possibility exists, but it would require some kind of ethical approval. Again, covert research is possible, but it's less frequently used because of the ethical quandaries, and you would just have to, make sure that that is cleared with an ethics board. Okay, does that all make sense? I know the internet is a strange place. Different rules will apply to different things. Things posted on YouTube are probably fair game, but the second you start interacting with the comments section and causing things to happen, then you're in a different zone. Okay, so this question of justice, right? So that was one of the other principles. Okay, so in practice, right, when we talk about potential harms, they need to outweigh. Potential harms shouldn't outweigh potential benefits. So if you're doing any kind of research, right, if the harm outweighs the benefit, the research is probably not worth doing, right? Or it's not going to get any kind of ethics approval. And you need to avoid research that's likely to avoid harm. Possible harm can be justified, but if it's like, oh yeah, this is definitely going to harm people in the course of my research, there's no way that you're going to be allowed to do that kind of research. And yeah, no one's life should get worse because they participated in your research study. So, if you collected information about people, published it, and then they got recognized and now they're being shunned by all their neighbors, or their fellow police officers won't talk to them anymore because of the things they said, you need to make sure that, that you're protecting them in some way, right? So you have to think far, far ahead in terms of the potential harms to people. And yeah, if the risks are more than they would encounter in everyday life, then you need that informed consent, right? So you have to say, these are the risks, these are the benefits, and then you choose. Okay. So, and I'll say this, like I didn't mention it before, but there's a lot of questions now, even about benefits of doing research, right? So you just clear this off. So I'll say a few words on this, and then we'll move on to the next topic, which is just quantitative research in general. So when we talk about benefits, this is a big debate. So normally, what we think of when we think of benefits, right? So I talked about, right, like sometimes we'll offer like $25 or, because I was educated in French, I always want to put the $ after the number. Like inevitably, like I always write money out like this. And I get corrected about this all the time. People are like, you need to put the $ before. And I'm like, not in French. In French, it makes more sense. Anyway, that was an aside for no reason. If you're talking to like a reasonably middle-class established person, right, $25 is a minor inducement. And it's not really a big deal, right? Like $25 is not going to be life-changing money. And we're talking about this at the CCR last year because we were talking about a research study, and they were offering unhoused people $100 to participate in the study. And the big question, we had this big ethical debate. We were doing a speaker series talk with the people doing the study, and we were having a little bit of a debate with them about whether this $100 represented too big of an amount for them to actually say no to, right? That because they were unhoused, right, they were super vulnerable, $100, right? So if you weigh out your, risks versus benefits, the benefit, whatever it is, can't be so big that would cause whatever participant you have to basically override that risk, right? To say, I know what the risks are, but I'm still going to participate because I just really need that $100. This also is why, sometimes researchers have done things like, you'll get, if you participate, you will be entered into a draw for like $5,000. I'm doing it in French. $5,000. And there's been a lot, and we've heard of some kind of studies actually not getting this approved, because the idea is, given the population you're dealing with, you're not paying them anything, right? You're giving them a chance to win, but the chance to win $5,000 is such a big draw, that for some people that's life-changing money, right? Maybe not for everybody, but for some, especially if you're dealing with vulnerable people, $5,000 is like, 2-3 months rent, right? That is a big chunk of change for them. So they might be like, okay, whatever the risks are, I don't care about the risks. The benefit is too big. So when you're weighing those risks and benefits, right? So if, when you're talking about the potential harms are greater than the risks of everyday life, you also have to make sure that, in the kind of this appreciation of justice as an important principle of research, whatever inducements you give, whatever benefits you're creating, have to be of an order that your participants could still reasonably say no to it. And it's not going, they're not going to be like, man, I gave up that amount of money that I absolutely needed to stay alive. And that's going to depend a lot, right? If you're looking at you're doing regular kind of middle-class people in your study, $25 or even $5,000 draw, probably not going to be a big deal. If you're talking about vulnerable people, young people, kids, people who are in poverty, unhoused people, that's life-changing money. And then you've got a much more serious question that needs to be asked. Okay, does that all make sense? Okay, I'm done on this. Let's see what that looks like. Okay, I'm going to discard all my doodles, fun as they are, and we're going to move to the next topic. So, slideshow number 5, which is quantitative research. Okay, and then we're going to get into, how am I doing for time? Okay, I'm going to log this guy out so I can just keep an eye on the clock on here. Okay, so we're going to talk quantitative research. So I know I've introduced this, but there's a couple of really important things. And one thing that in your second lab that's going to be really, really important for you to understand, which is operationalization. So we're going to talk about that today and probably on Wednesday. Okay, so quantitative research, we know what this entails, right? It has epistemological and ontological assumptions, right? So it's generally positivist in its epistemology, and it generally has a kind of realist view of ontology, right? There is a real social world that you can understand and that you can measure and all of these sorts of things. Generally speaking, right, we're talking about collecting numerical data. With quantitative research is right there in the name, quantities, right? You're trying to measure quantities, which you can then use to talk about social trends, and we already talked about this before. It's a deductive kind of process, right? So you're going from theory to data, and then you're testing hypotheses. It's that positivist, natural science approach to research, the objectivist conception of social reality. And the major concern is measurement validity, right? That you are measuring what you are hoping to measure accurately. Okay, and again, these are our steps in quantitative research. I won't go back over them again because we talked about these earlier, right? But you start with your theory, you develop your hypothesis, you design your research, you figure out how you're going to get the data, you figure out where and who, and you select your research participants. You collect your data, process it, analyze it, and then build your career writing about this study you did. So you put out your book or your article, and you kind of go from there. So very straightforward process. And again, you start with theory, and then you don't get data until down here, and you're moving to data, and then data analysis. Okay. Operationalization. So one of the critical things you have to do when you're talking about quantitative research is figuring out how to basically turn kind of concepts, right? So something you want to know about, right? That's your concepts. Into indicators or variables, right? So variables would be another word that can be measured in multiple states, right? That you can get multiple measurements of, right? And that is, in an interview, a questionnaire or an interview, but here would be typically a structured interview, which is basically a kind of questionnaire. So, sure, that's all you need to know about operationalization, right? That makes sense? No, I'm kidding. Okay, so sorry, I still hear people typing. But yeah, operationalization is basically taking something you want to know about, right? So it could be, income. It could be level of education, religiosity. It could be, I'm trying to think of other examples, and loneliness, right? If you want loneliness, depression, anxiety, right? And turning these into things that you can score in such a way as you can measure it and compare it with other people, other instances, right? And that you can get some kind of numbers out of, right? So these can be, it's damn near anything, right? You can operationalize into a variable almost anything. Okay, so let's say for something like secularization, because I'm a source of religion nerd. That's the other thing I do Monday, Wednesday, Fridays, teach source of religion. So let's take examples from sociology of religion, right? Let's say you wanted to talk about secularization. So your research question is secularization a decline in religious belief increasing from generation to generation? Operationalizing this is thinking of, so from generation to generation, what is that going to look like? How are you going to turn that into something you can measure? And secularization, right? How are you going to turn those things into measurable variables, right? So you need questions, right? So especially like where you're going to see this most is surveys, right? That's our number one quantitative tool is surveys. You yourself will be writing survey questions a little bit later in the term. So you need to turn these concepts into things that you can measure through some kind of survey question. So, you might want to ask, how do you measure religiosity? And what behaviors would people undertake that speaks to their religiosity or lack of religiosity? Now, again, you can do this for anything, right? Well, I should probably qualify that almost anything. But like, there's good question sets for things like that should be an E. Loneliness, right? Loneliness, depression, anxiety, social media addiction, right? Quality of social connections, relationships with parents. You can figure out ways to ask questions and operationalize a lot of different types of variables, but it does take some work. Okay, so operationalization. So for something like, if you wanted to measure religiosity, for example. Now, okay, I guess I'll tell you this right now and I'll kind of reiterate it as we go through. When you're thinking about operationalization, a good rule of thumb is don't reinvent the wheel. I'm going to put a big exclamation mark here. It took me a few years of teaching this topic to figure out that there are some major pitfalls to just having students try to operationalize things on their own. For example, a few years ago, before I sort of put in what I call we'll call this the iron rule of operationalization. I had a student, and I remember, I don't even remember who the student was, but I remember reading through their assignment, and they wanted to measure depression. And so they came up with a bunch of questions that they thought operationalized depression really well, and it was all things about oral hygiene, or like hygiene. It's like, how often have you brushed your teeth this week? Have you taken a shower this week? How often on average would you wash your hair in a week? Have you gone outside this week? Clearly that's what the student thought depression looked like. It was all things related to hygiene. And there's nothing inherently wrong with that, except, was it necessarily measuring depression? So what you're going to want to do is, if you have a thought, the first thing you want to look for is existing tools. Because a lot of these, social phenomenon that you might be really interested in, right? Say religiosity, say loneliness, anxiety, depression, you're not the first person to work on these questions. And so people will have come up with tools that are well tested. They've probably been worked on by sociologists and psychologists for years, if not decades. And so they're really well tuned to getting you the information that you want. So for example, these questions, right? These are what are called the B's of sociology of religion. So you ask questions that have to do with the 3 B's. when you want to measure religiosity. And there's well-established lists of questions that people use, right? Belief, behavior, belonging. Now, there's some variations in how people ask these questions, but they're pretty standardized in terms of what do you want to know about religiosity? Well, so you want to know what people believe, you want to know how they behave, like what are they doing, and you want to know about their belonging, right? So, like this question would be, probably around belief, right? Belief here, how religious do you consider yourself to be, right? And then they would rate it like very religious to very irreligious. And then belonging would be here, right? Belong. Do you consider yourself a member of a religious group? And almost every survey that wants to measure religiosity in some way is going to measure that. Sorry. Oh, I do have that here. So, self-identification, though, might not be, the best measure of an activity. So you want to ask, about behaviors as well. Things like, if we're talking about behaviors and we're talking about religiosity, you want to ask a bunch of different things, right? Because there's a bunch of, say, different religious behaviors. Religious service attendance, prayer, communing with the supernatural, meditation, all those things. Sacred text, right? Do you read the Bible, the Quran? Have you listened to the latest Taylor Swift album? Any of those kind of quasi-religious behaviors. So these would all be kind of behaviors, right? So these would be ways of operationalizing religiosity, right? And there's a bunch of different ways you can do the analysis. You can score people. So you give people like, if you have 15 questions, score each of them out of 5 and give them a score at the end. Anyway, that's statistical analysis. I promised I wouldn't do any stats, but there's lots of fun stuff you can do with the data. Right, so this would be, I always love this question. How, for a behavior, you could ask something like, how often do you attend religious services, not including weddings or funerals, right? Because people generally go to those, whether they're religious or not, and then, score it. I don't know why I drew an arrow there. Okay. You would score it along this scale, right? Okay. Same thing with, prayer or communing with the divine, several times a day, daily, weekly, several times a month, monthly, a few times a year, or never, right? And these are, so all of these you give a value to, right? You give us, they're a value that you can measure, and you can look at this measure across like individual cases or across whole populations. So you can operate, and again, you can ask a bunch of different questions. This is not, exhaustive. And again, I've got the sacred text, same kind of setup. But you can set this up in a lot of ways. The important thing is getting kind of things you can measure, right? Variables you can measure. And the more you can get, more is better. Right? So the more things that you could have that point towards, say, religiosity, loneliness, furryism, right? Whatever it happens to be. I got at least one half chuckle out of that joke, which I'm thankful for. Whatever it is you're trying to measure, right? Multiple measures is better than single measures. So just keep in mind, as you're trying to operationalize whatever variable you come up with based on your research questions, if you have a few more, the more you have, the better. Okay, I'll tell you about one tool. I'm gonna erase this, and I'm gonna tell you about one tool. So, because I mentioned loneliness, and here's where you want to, honestly, check out what is available in terms of tools. Bless you. One of the best tools that you could do if you're looking at loneliness is the UCLA Loneliness Index, which I believe is about 20 questions that are used to measure loneliness, right? To social connection and loneliness amongst people. On almost any topic you can think of, there are going to be existing scales that you can use to measure things, right? So if you, for example, wanted to look at ADHD, don't write questions. And again, I've seen it all because I've taught this class for long enough. Things like, do you have trouble concentrating, right? Or I have trouble, let's put it in a better way. I have trouble concentrating. Often, sometimes, seldom, never, right? Let's say that those were your options. It's not a great question, but there are existing scales to measure ADHD that you could reasonably give out to someone to sort of get a sense of if you thought they had ADHD, right? Or other kind of, you don't want to ever promise people that you're going to diagnose them because you're not a clinician, but you can use clinical tools to figure out where people are at in terms of some basic measure. Okay, I know that's a lot, but do use existing scales, right? And when I ask you to write a survey for this class, don't be shy about going and searching out existing scales that have good question sets and saying okay, do I have, how do you phrase operationalization? One of the tasks on the assignment, I'm gonna erase this all again, is to say how, right? So you have to operationalize, and then, essentially, I don't remember the wording of it on the assignment, but I know it's there. Say how you're going to operationalize or run this project. And right and there, what you're going to want to say is, I will measure concept X, or let's say loneliness for our using, I know, I don't want to be super pedantic about this, but this is something that people often get wrong, and I want you to get it right. UCLA loneliness index, right? So, or by administering 5 questions, 6 questions, 10 questions, using the 12 question UCLA loneliness scale, right? Or loneliness index. When it comes to operationalizing a concept that's well understood, right? Something like loneliness, or that has these existing scales, that's all you really need to say, right? That you're going to measure loneliness using, this 10 question scale, and you're done, right? But, and this again is something people frequently sort of struggle with, is articulating what operationalization is. When you write it out on your assignment, explaining your operationalization is just telling me how you're going to measure something. And if you're measuring it using this, all you have to say is, I'm measuring it using that, because you're all going to be very nice and use Chicago style because it's the best style. You're going to then put a little 1 beside it, and then you're going to cite, UCLA loneliness index at the bottom, right? And then switch slides for no reason. So it's not that APA and MLA aren't good, it's just that they suck and Chicago's better. So does that all make sense? I know I'm being a little bit pedantic and walking you through it, but it's something that I know students really struggle with when it comes to the assignment, is saying how you're going to operationalize your project that you're proposing. And it doesn't have to be complicated. It just has to be an explanation of how you're going to turn this into a variable. So you're going to do it by using this, right? Okay, again, I'm sorry to be pedantic. I just really want you to do well. I might be tilting the scale a little bit. Okay. So this is pretty easy, right? Concepts, what are concepts? Ideas or mental representations of things, that's not a super, it's an okay definition, but just think of it like something that you want to measure, right? A concept is something that you want to measure. So, there's, like I said, a million different things that you could measure. We'll highlight for a moment. Emotional labor, secularization, hyperactivity, right? So ADHD, academic achievement. I'm going to go back to my pen for a moment. If you think of this one, a lot of people are interested because you're students, and people are like, you really, really want to, talk about studenty things. I will just say, to warn you off some of the pitfalls. GPA, in my opinion, and I've had disagreements with people about this, is a terrible measure of academic achievement. Why is it a terrible measure? Because you only get it like once a term, right? Or maybe once a year. So in terms of like, a lot of people will conceive of projects like this, right? How does, participating in school clubs affect academic achievement? And, they'll have a great operationalization for like school clubs. And it's like, how many hours did you spend, right? How many times a week? And a good operationalization. And they're like, I'm going to measure it against GPA. And it's like, that's like a single measure, right? You get it at the end of the term. So if, for example, if this week I spent 18 hours at different clubs, right? Because it's the beginning of the semester and I'm super social and I'm trying every club on campus. But then at the end of the semester, I'm now spending 1 hour a week with that one club that I, really like, that I kind of stuck with. GPA would never capture that, right? Because it would just capture like that one thing that comes at the end of the term. So you'd have to think of a different way. Again, I'm just warning you off the pitfalls. You would have to think of a different way of measuring academic achievement. It could be like midterm grades, assignment grades, hours spent in class is not a measure of achievement, but whatever, like more granular things, right? So having people like test it against their midterm grades. How many hours versus the grades on your assignments that you receive back that week? So just something to keep in mind, because I know that's a popular one, and it's one that people always propose GPA, and I'm like, bad. We talked about that teacher study, not bad, just terrible. No, I've had this discussion and with some friends of mine we're all like on slightly different sides of this, and they're like, well, how else would you measure your academic achievement? I'm like, I don't know, a good way. Let's think of something that's a little bit better than GPA. And it's like, well, where we can measure it at different points and we get different measures for different levels of things, rather than just like, I didn't get a lot of sleep that week, so my GPA at the end of the term is, 3. I don't know. As you can tell, friendships were lost in this. No, but there were some strong disagreements that happened. So all sorts of things, right? Charismatic leadership, right? All of this stuff could be measured in different ways. Self-image, right? There's self-image scales, right? What do you think of yourself? All sorts of things. These are all concepts that you can measure, right? Oh yeah, your concepts, you're going to have a concept that's your independent, and you're going to have concepts that are your dependent variables, right? So you're always going to have different concepts at different stages. And yeah, independent is the one that's manipulated, or the one that you think is the cause in the cause and effect relationship, right? So if you're not in an experimental setting, you can still have an independent variable. The independent is going to be what you think is the cause, and the dependent is going to be the effect. Okay, so, your independent variable, it will be things like sleep versus your dependent being grades, right? So you think that more sleep is going to lead to people getting better grades. You're obviously not forcing people to sleep more or less, right? But you're saying like, oh, how much, maybe you're having them keep a sleep journal to say how many hours a night they slept, or downloading their Fitbit data with their permission, I hope, to see how much they slept, and then comparing it, say, with their grades or their academic performance or whatever it is you want to measure as your dependent variable. So even though you're not necessarily manipulating it, this is what you think is the cause. So you're measuring how changes in this affect changes in that. Okay, does that make sense? Okay, I know. It's probably, you're like, yes, this is stupid. I got this in SOC 100. Just want to make sure we're all on the same page. And yeah, the dependent is your outcome, right? Where basically you think that the cause is changing it in some way. All right, how are we doing for time? Okay, so measurement, why measure things, right? Measurements allow us to delineate small or fine differences between people or issues that we're interested in, right? So, and again, this is going to work the best the more granular your measurements actually are, right? So that's why I think GPA doesn't work great, because it's a very broad kind of measurement, like a very big one. But you want, basically we measure things so we can see like the difference between groups or between individuals, at a statistical level, right? So basically it allows us, or it gives us a way to identify and gauge. Sorry, what language am I speaking? A gauge, there's a U in there, and it seems like it should say gauge those differences with some consistency, right? And again, the idea, at least in theory, is that a lot of this would be replicable in other circumstances. So that you could take something like your UCLA loneliness index and you could measure seniors, right? You want to find out how Canadian seniors are doing in terms of their social connections and loneliness. You use the UCLA loneliness index. Oh, and now you're worried about teenagers, right? You could take that same tool and bring it over and use it with teenagers. So, we're getting some consistency in how we are, identifying and gauging those. It allows us to sort of try and figure out a couple of things, right? Estimate the relationship between concepts and the strength of that relationship. Is there a correlation? And often, we can try and figure out the direction of a correlation or a causation, which isn't actually always as obvious as we might think. I mean, the weird academic stuff I read, I'll just tell you. A couple of years ago, I was reading a study, and it was all about, the effect of, say, pornography use as it relates to religiosity, right? Because most of the literature says that, as religiosity declines, pornography use increases. But the authors were saying, actually, I think we've got the direction backwards. So we're actually going to say, test the hypothesis, this is H1 in this paper, that as pornography use increases, religiosity decreases, but it's that different sort of, the direction of it, we've thought of it in an inverse way. And sometimes by looking at the data in really consistent ways, we can try and figure out what the direction of that correlation or that causation is, and we can test against it, right? So we can test the variables to see if maybe we're misunderstanding the direction of causation. And that happens all the time. It's like we think that loneliness, having fewer friends leads to more loneliness, but maybe it's, symptoms of loneliness that cause people to go out less and therefore have less friends, potentially. Okay, all right. Can I do this in 2 minutes? I'll probably start again with this on Wednesday. But two types of definitions of a concept. We have nominal and we have operational, right? So the nominal definition, right? Honestly, just take it out of the dictionary. So generally speaking, if you have a concept, right, like religiosity, the nominal definition is really straightforward. An expression of how religious a person is. That would be, say, a nominal definition of religiosity. The operational definition, and this is what, I forgot how I phrase it. This is how I'm going to phrase it on the assignment. Your operational definition is how you're going to measure it. So that thing I wrote back, I am going to measure loneliness using the UCLA loneliness scale. That is an operational definition of loneliness. I'll come back to this and I'll talk about it again on Wednesday. But that is how you would give an operational definition. An operational definition, for one, is an active one, right? Sorry, too much stress on active. It's an active one. When you're asked for an operational definition, how are you going to measure the thing you're trying to measure? And you answer this by saying, I will, or this study will measure loneliness using the UCLA loneliness index, right? I will measure religiosity using a standardized 20-question scale of religious, belonging, belief, behavior. Okay, we'll talk about this again on Wednesday. I'll start here, but this is really important because you're actually going to be asked to do this, and this is something that people frequently have trouble with. So I'll talk about it some more and harp on operational definitions again. And I'll call IT and see if I don't have to haul a TV down next time.
GPA good, you get marks. It's
Yeah.
more for feedback. So if you use GPA as one of your variables, fail.
No. I would be like, this is not a great variable. You would probably want to think of, something more nuanced to measure academic achievement. But like if you did it, you get that 1.6% or whatever it is, and whether you did it